All right. Well, welcome to the special holiday edition of the N3C Community Forum. Presentation will be recorded and archived. And as usual, please use the Q&A button or post in chat for questions. Next slide, please. And so before I introduce Jimeng Sun and his ML pediatric presentation, the upcoming presentations, we're going to hear about acute upper airway disease in children with the Omicron B11527 variant next week, and then extracting patient level social determinants of health into OMOP by Jim Fong. The next week's presentation is by Blake Martin. October 31st is TBD, November 7th is canceled, and November 14th is impact of COVID-19 on clinical outcomes amongst acute myocardial infarction patients undergoing early invasive treatment strategy. Well, that should be interesting. That's okay. So we haven't had an update. We seem to be a little behind on updating, or there hasn't been a lot of submissions because we're still at 6.5 million cases, but we'll sort that out. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to hear from Dr. Jimeng Sun. Looking forward to this. Fusing medical knowledge and machine learning models for early pediatric COVID-19 hospitalization and severity prediction. And Jimeng is at Illinois Urbana-Champaign computer science and medicine. So this is interesting, relatively new program actually. So very technologically forward, I'm sure, because it's a great computer science department. And prior to that, he was at Georgia Tech. Okay, so Jimeng, you can share your screen. Welcome.
Thank you, Joe, for the introduction. Okay. Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Great. So this is a collaboration with a lot of people. Junyi Gao, Chao Jiyang, they're my students. And then my collaborators, George Haynes, Scott Barrows, Elise Albers, and Mary Staple, Sarah Warfield, and Dr. Adam Cross, and myself. And this involves multiple institutions, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, University of Illinois College of Medicine at PRE, OSF Healthcare, and Sarah also has an affiliation with VA Healthcare. And that's the team who did this. Of course, this is only possible because this N3C database. I'm very kind of appreciate the efforts behind the scene and to have such a amazing data sets, broad data set shared with the broader community. So the background for this work is we want to predict hospitalizations and severity of the hospitalizations among children. So COVID-19, we all know, it's a very have a severe impact to global health. I just checked today, there's among the US population, there's over 96 million COVID-19 cases, over 1 million deaths due to COVID. And if you look at just a pediatric population, and this is the hospitalization rate over time, when we start working on this particular project, towards the end of last year, and beginning of this year, so you can see there's a big spike in the pediatric hospitalization rate. So that's very concerning at the time. And the goal is, can we actually predict which children will get hospitalized, and then the severity of those hospitalization. And more details about this two tasks. And the task one is, can we predict who will be hospitalized in the next 35 days or 5 weeks? And so the setup in this as a data science and machine learning task is we go through all this pediatric patient data and identify the diagnosis of COVID-19, and then pick the index day of the next outpatient visit after diagnosis as the date of the prediction. We want to predict whether the patient will be hospitalized or not in the next 5 weeks. And using all the information prior to that outpatient visit. And so that's task one. So task two is related, right? If the patient actually got hospitalized, we want to predict the outcome of the hospitalization, or what we call severity prediction. So the severe outcomes are needing ventilations, ECMO machines, or cardiovascular intervention, or death, right? If any of this outcome happen, so we consider that's a severe case. If none of this outcome happened during hospitalization, we consider that's a normal case. So these are the two different tasks. And again, for hospitalization, we can use everything prior to the hospitalization to create those feature variables to make the prediction for the outcome of the hospitalization. And this is not a task we came up with. In fact, we participate in this particular challenge that also organized by NIH, this Sparta Community Challenge. So if you're interested, go check it out, and they provide more detailed description and background of this challenge. So we participate this challenge prior to this study, and then extended the study to a broader population that from the entire N3C data. And there's, for this community, I don't need more introduction about this data set, but for just broader audience out there, this is such amazing data resources for supporting research, especially COVID-related research. And it's a super large data set, have over 12 million patients and 4.5 million COVID cases, and over 14 billion rows of data, and there's hundreds of approved projects. We're just one of the projects that lucky enough to benefit from this data set. And yeah, so we're just presenting the result and of our recent publication using this N3C data. So to predict hospitalization and severity prediction, we have really two different options, right? There's a lot of work leveraging directly data, so just create all different sorts of features, then let the algorithm figure out what are the predictive ones, then build a more or less a black box model to predict the target, whether it's hospitalization or severity. And then there's of course, the one downside of the data-driven approach is it often black box and often ignores clinical practice. And so it's hard to understand. And it's often have the danger of, if you don't understand the model may not work when you actually deploy that in your scenario. So there's definitely some concern with the pure data-driven approach. But on the other hand, you have this knowledge-driven approach where if you understand this problem space very well, you can define what are the things you think are important. And for example, as we will show you, we build a knowledge graph for COVID hospitalization admission, and use that knowledge graph, you can kind of determine which patient will get admitted. And so that's a very effective way to make a prediction if you know the space very well. But if you get into a new space, you don't know the clinical situation very well, you don't have a good knowledge base to build this model. So that can be a limiting factor. And also the knowledge base you originally have may be limited, right? So the data-driven approach may actually bring some additional information that you should consider to add to your existing knowledge graph. And so we take a combination approach, as I will show you in the next few slides about the detailed methodology. We combine this data-driven approach, which is a knowledge graph for COVID hospitalization prediction and a severity prediction. And then we also leverage all the features and all the measurements in N3C database to see are there some other variables or other features that are actually predictive. We should also include them. And of course, there's some challenges to take this approach. One important challenge is how do we model all this relationship between different medical concepts or different, there's very complex EHR data that's we use here. How do you model the relationship between medication, lab measures, procedure, diagnosis? All those things can make this approach very, very difficult to develop. And so I will show you how we approach this problem by building using domain knowledge to build a knowledge graph, then learn a patient embedding, a patient representation with a graph neural network. Then combine the patient embedding with some knowledge-driven features, then build a classifier for at the end. So next, I'll go through the detailed models behind MedML. So it has this 4-step process. Step 1 is the data curation. We have to create the patient cohort and determine the label or the outcome of each patient, and also determine the index day for each patient so that we can we know what information we can use to make the prediction, what information we should not use. So the index is another very important information which we need to determine for each patient. And for this, I already explained the 2 tasks, right? So for hospitalization prediction, we identified the COVID-19 diagnoses, and then use the outpatient visit right after that as the index day. Then so anything before that can be used to create the features for the patient and the label for that patients, or whether they're hospitalized or not within the next 35 days. And hospitalization outcome, sorry, severity predictions, very similar. So we have the hospitalization date, then we use information before that to create the features, and then the outcome is determined by those 4 different type of events, right? If they are present, we consider that they're severe, and otherwise it's a normal case. So that's for the data set curation step, step A. Step B is to this knowledge-driven model, right? So for this part, it's the most, probably the most complicated part of this entire pipeline. So we have to, number 1, build this knowledge graph, this backbone of how clinician will decide whether the patient should be hospitalized or not. And then use that domain knowledge graph, then we can create for each patient, not entire graph are relevant, right? Maybe a subgraph for that each patient can be constructed. Then for each patient, we have this patient-specific subgraph. Then for this large number of subgraph, we can learn a graph neural network across them. So that will give us the embedding vector for the node on the knowledge graph. Then from this node embedding, we can determine the patient embedding. So each patient will have some embedding vector associated with each of those nodes. And I'll go into more details for the steps in the next few slides. And so that's step 2. It's this knowledge-driven approach. At the end of the day, each patient will have this embedding vectors. In our case, we have 65 node 65 medical concepts in the knowledge graph. So there's 65 dimension vectors for each patient from this step B. And step C is actually the more standard data-driven approach where we put all the features in N3C and consider them all together with a feature ranking metric, this propensity score metrics, to rank all the features based on how predictive they are to differentiating the different outcome labels, and then pick the top ranked features and use them as data-driven features for the model. And finally, we combine the knowledge graph patient embedding together with the top ranked feature from the data-driven feature selection process, and to combine the set of two sets of features together with patient's demographic information, some visit patterns informations. Then this hybrid set of features will be used as input to train a gradient boosting tree models. That will be our final predictive models for both tests. Okay, so this is the high-level overview of the method. So next, I will drill down a little bit more to this knowledge-driven feature, the knowledge-driven patient embedding learning part, and then quickly talk about the propensity score ranking part as well. So for this knowledge-driven part, just set up a little bit notations, right? So we consider each patient record as a sequence of visit. Then we have this vector representation for our patient records. And then each dimension in this patient record is just correspond to some indicator, some variables that whether it's a disease, a procedure occurrence, or lab values, or some medication usage, or some demographics dimension. So this is just a very high dimensional feature vector, but they also have this time aspect, so we can aggregate them together across time. And the knowledge graph, it's just a standard graph representation. And when doctor, in our case, our collaborator, Dr. Adam created this, Adam Cross created this. You think of this as a direct hierarchical graph representation. So there's a direction that when he created this, I'll show you in 2 slides. But when we learn the graph neural network, we actually ignore the direction, and so we treat every edge as a kind of undirected edges, and to learn the embedding for each node on this graph. So the node embedding is denoted by V. So V is maybe one of the node in this 65 node graph. And edge between 2 nodes, node I and node J, indicated by EIJ. So this is also an important part of the output from our model. So we can tell you how important, in terms of this relationship between 2 nodes. And some more details about how we construct this knowledge graph. And so in this particular work, we went through a different guideline, literature, and the practice at the hospitals when they actually admit pediatric patient into hospital. So they follow some guidelines. And so based on that, we created this domain knowledge graph. It has this different node types. Right? It have a major condition. I will show you there's, I think it's 6 different major conditions that will lead to hospitalization, such as hypoxemia and respiratory distress. These are 2 examples of major condition. Then there's a whole bunch of other conditions that kind of are related to the major conditions. And then there are also drugs, lab measure, procedure, that's related to any of those conditions. And the edges are also specified. So this edge derived from the clinical practice and medical literature. For example, there is edge between chronic respiratory failure to hypoxemia, and another edge between chronic respiratory failure and cerebral palsy, right? So those are two different edges on the knowledge graph. And in total, there are 65 features, 65 nodes on this graph. And this is just, I'm not going to read all this, but there's, if you're interested in the details, what are the different nodes in this knowledge graph? I mean, we listed here. So we have 37 conditions and 15 different drugs, 5 procedures, and 8 different measurements in this graph. And the resulting graph look like this, right? So it's kind of maybe hard to read, but it follows this directed graph. And finally, we have this 6 major reasons for hospitalization. If we zoom in just this part, you can see, hopefully we can see this hypoxemia is one reason, and then respiratory distress is another, and so on, dehydration, and so on. And then each one of those major condition will lead to some other condition that kind of related to that. So that's the underlying knowledge graph. Next, I'll show you how we can utilize this knowledge graph to construct patient feature vectors. And the way to do that is using a graph neural network method called graph attention network. For folks who are not very familiar with this part, it's okay. It's the next 2 slides, maybe a little bit technical, but this is a very promising and commonly used graph neural network. That's if you have a graph structures, you want to learn some predictive vectors for each node on the graph, and also the edge weight. So graph attention network is a method you can use. That's why we use it here. So the way to do it is for each patient, you can create a subgraph, right? So we have this original graph look like this, but for each individual patient, maybe only a subset of nodes are present, and we take that subgraph. And for each patient, we create a such subgraph. If we have 100,000 patients, we have 100,000 graphs, and then we first initialize randomly some embedding vectors for each of the nodes in this graph. Then we go through this embedding learning, and basically they will traverse a graph by aggregating information from the neighboring nodes. For example, we have this hypoxemia node. We want to learn an embedding vector for this node. What we would do is we would take all this neighboring node to hypoxemia, then aggregate the embedding vector for all of its neighbors, and weight it by the edge weight. That will give us the new embedding for hypoxemia. So this is the equation shows how do we determine the edge weight, Aij, between node I and J. Then similarly, once we have that weight, edge weight, we can then kind of update the embedding vectors, Zi, so that's give us a new version of the node embedding. So this is an iterative process. When you do a multiple iteration, then you can learn, keep updating the embedding until it stabilize. Once you have the embedding vector, every node will have vectors represent that node. And then for a patient, what you would do is, so this patient maybe have this set of nodes, right? Have a glucose, insulin measure, then has diabetes, then you have a metabolic derangement. And so that's kind of all these different nodes are present for a given patient. Then we just aggregate all the node embedding for this patient to get a patient level embedding G. And the way to aggregate them is we use this method called max pooling, just taking the maximum value for each dimension of the embedding vector. So that gives us the patient level embedding for a given patient. That will be the embedding vectors we use from knowledge graph. Then we can train a multi-layer perceptron and then use this loss to learn the graph neural network parameters. So that's for the knowledge-driven part of the method. Then we also have this data-driven feature selection, right? So if you look at the N3C database, it has millions of different concepts has been created by different researchers, and we want to leverage them all, right? So the way we did it is pretty straightforward. We can compute some propensity score to rank each individual features, and then we can pick the top K features with the highest propensity score to use them in our model. So that's the very simple data-driven feature selection. Once we have that, then we can combine the data-driven feature together with the patient embedding vector we computed with graph attention network, and then concatenate them. G is the graph embedding from the knowledge graph for a patient. Then the propensity score based feature vector is M, so we can concatenate them together with the demographic and visit level features S. So those are just typically contain age, gender, race, and some visit pattern like average time gap between visit, how many visits the patient had in the past, right? Those are all kind of very important. And then we concatenate this three set of features and pass them in through a gradient boosting tree to create, to make the final prediction, whether it's hospitalization probability or a severity risk. Okay, so that's the entire methodology we use. So next, I will talk about the experiments. A little bit more details on how we create the data set. And we take, this is a sequence approach. We take all the patient from N3C database, then only select the pediatric patient with COVID. So that gives us close to 500,000 patients. Then there's some additional criteria to ensure we have enough visits to determine the patient's outcome. So at the end of the day, we have over 143,000 patients for the first task, right? For the hospitalization prediction task. And among the 143,000 patients, 6,369 are positive patients, though those patients actually hospitalized within 35 days after the COVID diagnosis, and the vast majority, 137,000 are not, so they are negative patients. And then we split the patient, all this entire data set into three buckets: training, 60% trainings, 20% validation, 20% tests at random. So that's hospitalization prediction, how we create the cohort. For severity prediction, very similar. We also pass through a similar set of inclusion/exclusion criteria. And at the end of the day, we have 11,000 patients who are hospitalized. That's the data set we use for the second task. And then 831 of them have this negative outcome, where one of this deaths, ECMO, cardiovascular support or ventilation, right? So, some patients can have multiple of them, but a vast majority have none of them. So those are 10,000 are negative patients. And again, we split them 60, 20, 20. So to do this training validation test. And so that's how we create the data set. Then a little bit more about the other method we compared. So I talked about the MedML algorithm. We have a different variation of our own algorithm just to show how important are different components. So this MedML propensity only use the data-driven feature. So this top ranked features based on propensity score, those are the things we use. And then we can also just use the domain knowledge, right? That's 65 variables in the knowledge graph. That can be our 65 features. And again, so that's another variation of our method. That's called MedML domain. And finally, we can also just use the patient embedding as output from the graph attention network. So that's another variation of our algorithm. Then we also compare against many different machine learning baselines. such as multi-layer perceptron, XGBoost, decision tree logistic regression. And so for all those different methods, baseline method, they use the same number of feature as our method, MedML. So there's more comparable in that sense. And next, I'll show you the prediction performance for this two tasks. The first one is for hospitalization prediction, task 1. And here's the performance of MedML performed the best, and it's 3% higher than the best baseline and 4% higher than the on the error standards precision recall curve, and 12% higher on the other metric mean of recall and precision. So, but the key message is across the board, it's the MedML consistently outperform all this baseline method. And also they're better. I mean, this MedML is better than the different variation of them. And so which also shows all those different components are kind of important. And so it's important to kind of have this hybrid approach. And similar observation from the severity prediction, we can see that for predicting the severity risk, and we have MedML perform consistently the best. I mean, for AUC in terms of at the level of a close to 0.7, PR AUC is 0.22, and mean recall and precision at 0.27, and consistently higher than all these different baselines by a big margin. And again, similar observation, right? All this different variation perform worse than the full version. So it's important to have all these different components in the method. And so keep in mind, in all this experiment I shown, we use 80 features. So that's include both the data-driven features and also the knowledge-driven features. And so that's only 80 features are required to achieve this level of performance. And next, I'll show you some more detailed performance analysis. When we varied the number of features we kept in the models from 80 to 200, right, in all this two different tasks, I mean, 3 different metrics, you can see that it's actually quite stable. As you increase number of features, I mean, most of our variation doesn't actually change. I mean, so that shows the data-driven feature. I mean, when you keep adding additional features, that it doesn't actually bring additional performance gain. Maybe on the severity prediction, on one of or two of this metric has a slight improvement when you increase the feature from 80 to 160 or 200, but those improvement is not very consistent. So we just kept the 80 because we felt that's a more interpretable and also kind of more parsimonious type of model we can use in practice. And next, I'll show you when we use, I mean, the previous result, we split the patient at random. And this result is we split by time, right? So if we take a sliding window of 6 months to train a model, then test this model in the next 3 months, then slide the window forward and forward, so 8 times. You can see this, how the performance across time, how they perform, and for a different model, consistently MedML, which is the purple line, performed the best on the top, and all the other methods are performed worse than our method. And there's some up and down in terms of the predicted performance over time, but I mean, but the difference is not that big. There's a small fluctuation when we train in a sliding window fashion. And we also did this spatial validation, I mean, cross validation. So we can, I mean, this is another good thing about N3C data. It's not just from a single hospital. It's actually cover entire United States, and we actually split the data across 9 US Bureau division, so based on geographic regions, and we trained the model with 8 of those division, then tested on the one division. So we do this kind of leave one out type of validation. You can see still pretty consistently across all different division, different regions. The performance has some up and down, but I mean, they are pretty consistent across. And maybe some interesting observation is for the region have a lower positive ratio, meaning that whether they have the lower percentage of patients got hospitalized. And in those cases, the model performed slightly worse. It's probably because the data is very imbalanced in that case, so the model performs slightly worse. But still, there's a good level of performance you can achieve by training with other regions' data tested on a completely different region. So it's much better than we originally expected when we do this across geography. And next, I want to show you a few the feature level analysis, right? So what are the important features that are predictive for hospitalization, for pediatric hospitalization, and the severity? So these are the top ranked features, and we're showing the Shipley value, I mean, how important those features are. And you can see that they have a lot of overlap for these two different tasks. And all the knowledge-driven features are pretty important, but still some data-driven features were not originally in the knowledge graph. For example, CG beta, I think is one of the lab tests, turned out to be very predictive that were not in the original knowledge graph. And later on, I believe that Dr. Adam added that back into the knowledge graph. So that shows the benefit, right, with this hybrid approach. You can actually learn something you don't originally know, and you can actually improve or refine your knowledge. And some more detailed feature level importance analysis, right? The previous slides showing you in aggregate how important each features are. And this is just showing on the patient level, what are the distribution of the observation that on all these different lab measures or different visit patterns. And some interesting patterns can be observed. For example, if you look at number of visits, which consider as the important feature, and if the visit number is greater than, I think it's greater than 5, and that has a positive contribution to hospitalization. So if the patient already have 5 visits in the past, right, that's a very good indication this patient probably should be hospitalized, which makes sense. And then for this lab measure, right, creatinine, and if it's greater than, I think it's greater than 0.6, and it's considered significant, then it has a positive association to the outcome. And similar observation can be seen by on the severity prediction. The important features are BMI, because BMI weights are kind of very much the same, similar, creatinine, glucose, and some visit level patterns. And we also did some analysis on across different demographic features such as age and gender, race, ethnicity. There are some differences, but we didn't see a very clear patterns or across the board. So there's no very strong conclusion we can make, but the details of all our analysis in the table, in the paper. So if you want to study this, you can also check out our papers. And this is the final slide in the results section. We also look at, calibrate the model prediction. So it's actually calibrated pretty well. The predicted probability and the true probability actually matches very well. So you can use the prediction as a good probability or risk score, and because it's well calibrated with a true probability. And so in conclusion, today I talk about one of the paper we published recently at the iScience journal that we trying to predict hospitalization and severity for pediatric patient with COVID. And the approach is a hybrid approach, combine knowledge graph and clinical knowledge and pure data-driven features from data. And thanks to the N3C database, we can do this analysis to show this hybrid approach actually perform better than the other approach that do not use both side of information. And future work, we are looking at right now doing some spatial temporal prediction for COVID hospitalization at the county level to see, how to best distribute resources across different geography. And another thing, maybe go beyond COVID, that's a lot of this pediatric hospitalization, the work we have done here is, our medical collaborator believe is generalizable to broader population, whether they have COVID or not. A lot of this knowledge graph can be reused there for general pediatric hospitalization prediction. So we're also looking in that direction. Okay, thanks for the invitation. Thanks for N3C community, and I'll stop here, answer questions.
That's a really interesting method, very sophisticated. Anjali Sharakanther, sorry for the pronunciation, has a question, and I think we're in the process of trying to promote this person. Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Should I?
Yes.
This
Great.
is a question?
Yeah.
Okay, Yeshen has a question. How does the computation burden look? Say you need to apply the method to a much larger data set, possibly involve all patients in N3C database to study another research question. Is it feasible to adopt the approach? I think the computational, it's definitely heavier than a standard simple logistic regression or something like that, but it's definitely doable. We use the N3C environment. We pretty much apply to a pretty large data set, right, with 140,000 patients. Yeah, for the entire adult population, it's larger, but I think the method is scales linearly with respect to the patient, because we do this batch by batch, and as long as the knowledge graph is not super large, that part is more of the constraint, right? If you have a 100,000 node huge graph, that will be a lot more expensive. We have a relatively smaller graph. It's only 65 nodes for this test. So even with 100,000 patients, it trains pretty fast. And if you have 1 million patients, I think it's probably still doable with a reasonable computing, like GPUs server should certainly be able to do that as well. Cool. There's another question. There are patients come from COVID tests not available or inconclusive. Where did you lump these patients? So there's the inclusion. Yeah, that's a very good question. So all this inclusion exclusion part of the definition is actually quite tricky, because the real world data, it has missing, right, and also the time may be also kind of maybe not that precise. I think we just followed the challenge definition. So the organizer have put in a lot of thoughts how to define the cohort. We just largely follow what they specified and in term of the cohort definition. I think in this particular case, I believe if we don't have the COVID diagnosis confirmed, then they will not be included in the in our training data set. Okay.
So have you been have you applied this outside of COVID to any other data sets? That would be very interesting to hear.
Yeah, we right now have been starting to look at the general pediatric hospitalization prediction. So there, I think we started with bronchiolitis, and so that's the next thing we has been looking at, but we don't have the result yet. And the spatial temporal aspect of this hospitalization prediction is another derivation, and the methodology there has to be changed, so it's not the same methodology, but as long for the patient level prediction, the methodology is can be very similar.
So when you say spatial temporal, do you mean where the patients live, or what's the spatial aspect?
All spatial is the location. So here we're predicting patient, right? So patient, whether they should be hospitalized or not. So that's a future work we have been working on, about to submit. That's just county, right? So predict how many cases, how many hospitalization cases will be happening in a given county. So that's a related but different task.
Have you thought about including text in the embedding process?
I mean, if we have that information, I think can be very useful. I don't know whether that's the clinical notes are part of the data. I mean, I assume it's not, so that we haven't used that clinical notes. But if it's there, I'm very interested in do some analysis on the clinical notes.
Okay, yeah, it's the answer to that is complicated, obviously, in the sense that sharing of these things. But I was actually asking in a more general sense, although there are N3C related studies that involve that. But it's certainly embedding is for of clinical notes seems like a logical thing that you'd be likely to try.
Yeah, if we can access that type of data, I think we have trying to access some local hospitals data, but that's a much smaller scale data set where the clinical notes are present, but that's also have a smaller data set, sample size may be an issue. So
Great.
yeah.
So a question from Hannah Blau, what happens in the case where a child is admitted to the hospital on the same day or within a few days of the positive COVID-19 test? There would be no intervening outpatient visit to determine an index state.
Right. I think, yeah, so this is for, let me think. I think that the test, sorry, the challenge, they put in a lot of effort to define this. I know for the second task, which is severity prediction, they take into account the possibility of the COVID diagnosis may be delayed, right? So that the hospitalization maybe happened prior or right before the diagnosis of COVID, or maybe the documentation is not the kind of, there's some delay. So they have some small window so that they include broader set of patients for the second task. For the first task, I believe because the sample size issue is less severe, I think they just take the index day as a outpatient diagnosis of that. If someone, so in your case, right, this patient may be so severe, I mean, immediately hospitalized, right, that's whether that patient is included in this task, I have to check. I don't remember exactly how those patients are handled, but they're very good question.
Good, thanks. So when I see you've got a GitHub site, so I assume the code is available.
Yes, the code is available. Data is you have to access through N3C, but the format, we put in some sample synthetic data there. At least the format is similar, and you can use it. If you have access to N3C, you can probably adapt this code and apply it there to your project.
Excellent. Well, I'm sure people will be very interested. I certainly am. All right. Well, this is great. Very, very interesting work. Any other questions? Okay, we have, let's see. I see a chat. Andrew Williams. Andrew, I think you're a panelist, so go ahead.
So the use of the term propensity score for most people evokes this method for achieving covariate balance when you're comparing treatments. So it means patients who are matched have the equal likelihood of or propensity for actually receiving those treatments of interest. And I was just wondering if you could define what propensity means in the propensity based data-driven method that was one of the methods you analyzed here.
Oh yeah, that's maybe a bad naming on our end. Let me just go to that slide. It's a really very simple. Let me see. So okay, so this is really a ratio between. So let's see, frequency of the medical concept in the positive and negative cohort. So this is, let's say for features. I mean, let's say what was diagnosed like asthma, right? Let's say asthma is a feature. Want to decide the score. This propensity score, probably a bad name. So I mean, let's say some importance score, right? And then we just take the ratio between the maybe I don't know. I mean, 5% of the patients hospitalized has asthma, then 1% of them in the general population or who are not negative patient cohort, right? This will be a 5-to-1 ratio for the numerator. Then denominator, we do the same thing, right? As the patients, I think it's the population size of the positive and negative cohort. It's just what's the so it's a ratio between this. And then if this score is high, that means this particular feature is more prevalent in the positive groups than in the negative groups.
Great.
Thanks.
All right. Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks for really a fascinating talk. And that's really a method that I think a lot of people are going to want to experiment with. It's very, very, very interesting. All right. Well, thanks. And we'll see you all soon next week. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.